One of the things I love about comics is you have the ability to create everything we see on the page. There is nothing that can be left to chance, everything is a decision made by a writer, artist, colorist and letterer on what gets seen, and specifically how it gets seen. The obvious thing is how characters look and the backgrounds and the things they're doing to progress the story within the panels. But it even comes down to things like clothes. Someone at some point is making a decision on what characters wear, what colours they are, and how that changes through the story. The World of Edena by Moebius is such a great example of how comics and visual stories can use clothes as a unique part of the storytelling by building it consciously into the narrative. It all starts with the central idea, and for Edena it's two people trying to find a missing ship. These people are Stel and Atan, who you see here in the way they start the story in this chapter, which is the Garden of Edena. It's interesting right from the get-go with the first look at this new world they've gone to, because the page is split by the horizon. Below, lush greenery, there's brown and green earthy textures, and above is Stel and Atan in an orange ship wearing purple, deep orange, colours we don't quite see anywhere else. They're physically placed in the bubble as well, separated from the world again. But let's take a look at the costume choice here. On the next page we get a better look, as Stel and Atan lean over the ship to look at the world below, and you can see how they really do not fit into this world at all. The deep orange, that purple, that blue as I mentioned, it's all removed from the world entirely, which is almost essentially green at this stage. That immediately adds a layer to the narrative, because the book is telling us that these characters don't belong here. And yes, that is the central conceit of the narrative too, and so it's a wise choice that the art also serves to back up that part of the story. Because these characters really pop from the background, they don't blend in. Their colours match themselves, with the orange and blue being fitting, the yellow and purple fitting together as well, but they sit apart from the green of the world quite distinctly. And the reason that works is by having separate palettes. There's a palette for the world, but there's also a palette for Stel and Atan, and those two palettes don't blend together well. It's reinforced a page later when they land, and their purple and orange yellowness is a striking part of the scene when we pull out to see a wider shot of Edena. So you're getting three instances of storytelling through these pages, right? Because through the dialogue of these characters we're learning about their plan, what their next actions need to be, and a little bit about driving the plot forward as well. Through the backgrounds, we're learning what Edena looks like, what it's got available in terms of the apple and the landscape, which will come into play later on. And through the costume and props of the characters specifically, we're learning how alien this whole place is to them. Or maybe more specifically, it's how alien they are to that landscape. And so once you've established that you can build costume and colour into the narrative to separate the characters from the world, well, now what? Well, through establishing that part of the visual language, you can start to adapt it to build around the central theme of the story you're telling. And the idea here being that as Atan and Stel begin to involve themselves in the world, they lose the trappings of their old selves and get rebirthed as something new. It happens not long after their initial descent into the world, where Stel picks up an apple from the ground and eats it. At this stage, you'll notice he's taken off his jacket, and that's one layer that's come off. And that's not a coincidence, it's Moebius using costume as a narrative signifier, as we'll keep discovering. The eating of the apple is a really big deal, it's a massive moment in the narrative, and it coincides with them becoming more part of the world, because they've taken a chance on eating something that comes from Edena. A page later, the world turns purple as the sky goes down, and a couple of panels after Atan, who's also dressed in purple, took her first bite of the apple. A page after that, as the night descends, they become the colour of the world for the very first time. The lighting changes the colour of their clothes so that they look like a regular part of the landscape. If you look at that final panel, it looks like they belong right there. They blend in, they fit the landscape, and even the speech balloons disappear so they don't call attention to them. For the first moment in all these pages in Edena, they belong. And that's because you see the palette shift from having two individual palettes for the characters and the world to having one overall palette for that scene. And the story continues on. These characters go deeper into the world, and so their costumes also change. They become dirtier, more worn out, and they start to include, interestingly, some of the world in their attire. Stel here wears a flower he's found in his hat, their sleeves have been ripped off, they've got thin branches wrapped around the headgear. You can tell the difference in their story immediately because of those costume changes. And the book doesn't actually give us all that time in between what we've just seen and this moment, it just sort of jumps. But it relies almost entirely on that change in costume to give you all the story of their adventures. And the world around them is now starting to blend in with the colour of their clothes. Gone are the bright jackets, instead the softer colours of blue and yellow, which we now actually start to see replicated in the plant life around them as well. So is this a case of the world being informed by its new hosts, or is it just Moebius showing us they're becoming ingrained in the world? Either way, it does create that desired effect. We're not having these characters stand out as much anymore. And it's not until a few pages after that, when Stel and Atan actually get separated, that we see Stel fully become immersed in the world, told through costume. He's wearing orange and yellow, and now his skin has become tanned, and his brown hair completes the earthy tones of his individual palette. But the background around him is also the same. It's a very, very similar palette. And that continues throughout that sequence, where he's cast against orange backdrops, or where he's even given a bluer tinge for that moment, and even a slightly greener shift for this one. Now this character's palette isn't just for him, as it was in the earlier sequences, but rather these panels themselves are sharing one whole palette. And it means that you forget that this character was an alien, that this character wasn't from this world. He looks like he just fits in. And in each of these cases, the story is able to be read entirely through the costume and how it relates to the world around it. And that seems pretty incredible even as I'm saying it now, but it's the reality of knowing that everything on your page is constructed, and so everything, and really everything, is a tool for you to use to drive whatever your central theme, plot, idea, thing is. Even down to the colour of someone's clothes, how those clothes change, even if they just stop wearing those clothes. It's why Moebius was a master, because he didn't leave any of these options on the drawing board. It's all right there on the page. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues thanks to the support of people through patreon.com/strippanelnaked, where there's exclusive new content and articles every single week. Check it out and please consider supporting. For more comics talk, you can find me on Twitter @HassanoE, and finally hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and we'll see you next time.